What becomes of a wandering heart that flees the light, only to find the love it feared waiting gently within? Good evening, dear friend. Wherever you are listening from, settle into this quiet moment with us now, feel at home, and remember to subscribe for more peaceful stories to rest. This is the journey of Augustine, whose brilliance could not quiet his longing, whose sins could not silence grace, and whose surrender transformed him into a guiding voice, whose wisdom continues touching hearts across centuries with gentle, enduring light today. Carrying the quiet wonder of this beginning, let us step gently into the earliest chapter of Augustine's life, where the world around him was still small, and every sound and shadow carried the promise of a future not yet understood. In the warm hills of North Africa, in the Roman town of Tagaste, a child entered the world in the year 354, a child who would one day move nations with his words, though on this first morning he was simply the son of a hopeful mother and a complicated father. His name was Aurelius Augustinus, and from the first breath he drew, two very different currents of influence surrounded him. His mother, Monica, held him close with a love carved from faith, humility, and prayer. She believed that every child was born into a story far larger than themselves, and she whispered tender blessings over him, as though trying to drape her faith across his tiny shoulders like a garment that would someday fit. His father, Patricius, carried a heart shaped by the customs of the empire, a man who valued honor, prosperity, and earthly achievement. He admired the promise he saw in his son, not for spiritual greatness, but for academic triumph and social advancement. And so, Augustine's earliest world, its sights, scents, and rhythms, was shaped by this quiet tension, a home caught between devotion and ambition. The house in Tagaste was modest, framed by gardens that held the heat of the African sun, and by evenings when the family gathered around simple meals, where Monica's calm presence mingled with Patricius's restless determination. As Augustine grew, he noticed how differently his parents approached life. His mother prayed in silence each dawn, tracing the sign of the cross over her heart with the soft confidence of one who believed she was never alone. His father, though affectionate in his own way, viewed the world through calculations: what must be done, who must be pleased, what future must be built. To the child Augustine, both ways of living seemed strong, yet neither fully answered the questions that already stirred inside him. Why did he feel drawn toward goodness one moment and pulled toward mischief the next? Why did joy fade so quickly? And why did his heart never entirely rest? Even in childhood, Augustine carried a sensitivity that made him deeply aware of the beauty and fragility of life. He watched the changing colors of the African sky as though trying to read a secret written in gold and rose. He listened to the chants of the church carried on the wind from distant gatherings, their melodies reaching him long before he understood their meaning. And yet, like many children, he also felt a stubborn streak rising inside him, a mixture of curiosity and rebellion that sometimes led him into small acts of mischief. Monica corrected him gently, guiding him with stories from Scripture and soft reminders that the soul must learn to love the good. Patricius corrected him with firmer tones, believing discipline prepared a boy for the challenging world ahead. Augustine absorbed both, storing every word and every silence deep within him. When he was still quite young, sickness touched his small body, and for a brief moment death seemed to draw near. Monica, terrified yet resolute, begged God to spare her child. She asked the local church for baptism, believing it would be a shield of grace upon him. But as Augustine recovered and his life steadied, the plan for baptism was delayed, following the common custom of the time. He would be baptized later, they told her, when he was older, wiser, more secure in his understanding. Monica yielded, though not without a quiet ache, sensing how precious the moment of grace might have been. Augustine, too young to understand what had almost occurred, continued forward as though nothing had happened, unaware that this early brush with mortality would later become a silent thread woven through his spiritual journey. As he grew into boyhood, lessons began to fill Augustine's days. His parents, recognizing his sharp mind and hunger for learning, made sacrifices to send him to the best schools Tagaste could offer. There, among wax tablets and worn scrolls, Augustine first tasted the power of words. Language fascinated him, the way ideas could be shaped like clay, the way stories could lift the imagination beyond the boundaries of a small town. He excelled quickly, but even then, he carried a frustration familiar to many children. He longed for the freedom of games and laughter, rather than the strict routines imposed on him. He disliked the beatings used by teachers to enforce discipline, and he often wondered why a world made by a loving God would also contain such harshness. Yet slowly, his brilliance began to shine, and those around him began to see in him a potential that set him apart. Monica watched with a mixture of joy and concern. She was proud of her son's gifts, yet aware that intelligence can become a dangerous companion when unmoored from virtue. She prayed that his learning would lead him toward God, not away from him. She prayed that his heart, so quick to feel and so quick to wander, would someday return to the truth she cherished. She prayed above all that her son would learn to see his life as a gift, a pilgrimage rather than a possession. And though Augustine did not yet understand the depth of her hope, he sensed her love as something steady and enduring, a quiet anchor in a world that felt increasingly wide and unpredictable. Tagaste itself shaped him in gentle ways. The quiet markets, the hum of neighbors tending their work, the faint ringing of church bells in the distance, the fields dotted with olive trees, each became part of his inner landscape. Yet even in this peaceful environment, Augustine began to feel a stirring that he could not name. He sensed that the world beyond his hometown held something vast, something alluring, something that called to him in the hidden corners of his mind. Whether it was knowledge, adventure, or desire he sought, he did not yet know, but he knew he would not remain in Tagaste forever. The first years of his life passed like a river, quietly shaping the banks around it, sometimes gentle, sometimes troubled, always moving forward. And though no dramatic event had yet appeared to define his path, something deep within him was already waking. A desire to understand himself, a longing for meaning, a restless yearning that would someday lead him through storms both within and without. For now, he was simply a child of North Africa, a boy caught between two worlds, already beginning to feel the tension of a heart that wished to love the good, yet struggled to choose it. And so, as the sun continued to rise over Tagaste and Augustine's childhood, unfolded in its warm, steady glow. The foundations of his future journey were quietly laid, a journey of longing, wandering, and eventual homecoming. The seeds were planted, though the fruit would come only with time, struggle, and grace. And perhaps that is how many great stories begin, not with thunder or revelation, but with the quiet shaping of a young soul learning how to see. And from these early days in Tagaste, the heart of the young Augustine was already beginning to search for something greater, though he did not yet understand what it was he sought, or where it would lead him in the years to come. Carrying the gentle thread of Augustine's earliest years, we move quietly into the next stretch of his young life, where childhood curiosity began to sharpen into the bright, deliberate searching of a mind awakening to its own power. Those who knew Augustine in Tagaste often spoke of his quick intelligence, how easily he grasped ideas that left other boys struggling, how words seemed to arrange themselves naturally around him even before he understood their deeper weight. And as he stepped beyond the tender simplicity of childhood, the rhythm of his days shifted toward the steady discipline of study, a path his parents believed would lead him toward honor and opportunity. Patricius, with his restless ambition, dreamed of seeing his son rise through the intellectual ranks of the empire. Monica, watching quietly, prayed that education would nourish her child's soul rather than simply sharpen his pride. Yet both parents agreed on one thing. Augustine's mind was a gift that needed to be nurtured, even if the discipline required to shape it often felt difficult or harsh. In the small schoolrooms of Tagaste, Augustine first encountered the structured world of grammar, rhetoric, and early philosophy. These lessons, though demanding, awakened something inside him, an excitement, a quickening, a sense that ideas carried a kind of music he longed to understand. Yet for all the beauty he sensed in learning, Augustine also felt frustrated by the rigid methods used to teach him. Corporal punishment was common, and he often wondered why teachers who claimed to guide children toward wisdom resorted to fear and pain. He later looked back on these early frustrations with a mixture of humor and sorrow, remembering how he dreaded reciting lessons he knew perfectly well, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he feared the sting of correction. Still, slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to excel. His teachers noticed, his classmates envied, and his parents hoped. Monica, though proud, worried about the spark of pride she saw growing in him, an eagerness not merely to learn, but to be admired for learning. She prayed for him each night, asking God to shape his heart with humility even as his intellect flourished. She knew, as mothers often do, that a brilliant mind without a gentle spirit can become a restless and dangerous companion. Augustine, unaware of her silent watchfulness, moved forward with the confidence of youth, feeling the thrill of his own abilities without yet recognizing the responsibilities that came with them. When he reached an age where more advanced education became necessary, the family began discussing his next steps. The schools in Tagaste, though adequate, were no longer enough for a boy of Augustine's talent. The nearest city offering the kind of training he needed was Madaris, a place filled with the bustle and noise of Roman influence, where scholars gathered and young men tested their minds against one another. Sending him there required financial sacrifice, and Patricius worked tirelessly to provide it, believing it would pave the way for their family's rise. Monica accepted the plan with a mixture of hope and quiet unease. She knew the world beyond their town carried dangers, temptations of mind and body alike, and she feared her son, still tender in virtue, might be swayed by influences stronger than he could resist. But she also trusted that God watched him even when she could not. So Augustine left Tagaste for Madaris, stepping into a world far wider, louder, and more complex than the one he had known. The moment he arrived, he felt something shift within him. The noise of the marketplace, the lively debates between students, the sense of freedom in being away from home, all of it thrilled him. Madaris was a place where ideas moved like wind, where young men competed with words instead of weapons, where knowledge felt like a doorway into greatness. Augustine loved it instantly. He absorbed his lessons with ease, mastering grammar and rhetoric, devouring stories from classical authors, and discovering in philosophy a new realm of fascination. But along with this blossoming intellectual curiosity came a new kind of temptation, the lure of being admired for his brilliance. Among classmates, he quickly gained a reputation for cleverness, and the praise fed something inside him that would later become one of his greatest inner battles. Yet even in this season of awakening, Augustine carried within him a growing awareness that learning alone could not soothe the mysterious ache he felt inside. There were moments, often in the quiet just before sleep, when a strange restlessness stirred within him, a longing he could not name, a desire for something beyond achievement. He did not yet see it as the early whisper of a deeper spiritual calling. He simply felt unsettled, like a traveler standing at the edge of a vast landscape he longed to explore, but did not yet understand. When his initial period of study ended, Augustine returned briefly to Tagaste, only to find himself caught between two worlds, the intellectual excitement of Madaris and the familiar comfort of home. During this time, a troubling incident occurred that Augustine would later recount with sorrow in his Confessions. He joined a group of boys in stealing pears from a neighbor's tree, not out of hunger, nor even out of enjoyment, but simply for the thrill of doing something forbidden. The pears themselves were not particularly delicious, and after stealing them, the boys barely cared to eat them. What stayed with Augustine was the confusion he felt afterward. Why had he done something he knew was wrong? Why had the wrongdoing itself seemed to hold a strange, fleeting sweetness? This moment, small though it was, opened a deeper question in his young heart. Why did he so often feel drawn toward what he ought to avoid? Even as he pondered this, a new chapter was waiting. Patricius, determined to give his son every possible advantage, made plans to send him to Carthage, one of the great centers of learning in the Roman world. Augustine was excited by the prospect, but before he departed, another significant event touched his family. His father fell ill. Though he had lived most of his life outside the Christian faith, Patricius's heart softened in his final days, and he accepted baptism before passing. Monica, though grief-stricken, found comfort in knowing her prayers for her husband had not been in vain. Augustine watched her grief with a mixture of tenderness and distance. He felt sorrow for the loss of his father, yet his mind was already turning toward the future, toward Carthage, toward the adventures and ambitions that awaited him there. Standing at the threshold of this transition, Augustine sensed again the deep stirring within him, the same restlessness that had followed him from childhood. For all his learning, all his excitement, all his hopes, there was still something unfilled inside him. He wondered quietly if Carthage would offer the answers he sought, or if it would only deepen the hunger he felt. As Augustine prepared to leave for the great city, the path of his life stretched before him, bright with promise, shadowed with danger, and shaped by the unseen hand that had been guiding him since his first days in Tagaste. He did not yet know how far this journey would carry him, or how deeply it would change him. He knew only that he was ready to step forward, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the restless longing that had begun to define his young life. And from this moment of departure, the question lingered softly in the background. Where would this bright, eager mind wander next, and what would it find when it arrived there? Carrying the soft echo of Augustine's departure from childhood into youth, we now move into a season where desire, curiosity, and inner conflict began weaving themselves into a more complicated pattern within him. For although he set out toward Carthage with the eager brightness of a young man stepping into a world of learning, he was also stepping into a world of temptations that would shape him in ways he could not yet imagine. It is often in youth, when the mind is awakening, the body is strong, and the heart is quick to feel, that the soul discovers just how easily it can be pulled in many directions at once. And Augustine, endowed with both a sharp intellect and a sensitive spirit, found himself caught between the thrill of freedom and the quiet whisper of conscience that followed him, even when he tried to ignore it. Carthage, when Augustine arrived, was alive with energy. The great port city shimmered with all the contrasts of the Roman world, its academies filled with scholars and poets, its streets bustling with merchants, its theaters echoing with laughter and applause, and its taverns warm with late-night revelry. For a young man eager to learn and just as eager to experience life, it offered an intoxicating blend of opportunity and indulgence. Augustine threw himself into his studies with remarkable enthusiasm. He excelled in rhetoric, mastering the art of persuasion, sharpening his ability to sway audiences with eloquence. His teachers admired him, his peers respected him, and he knew he had found a place where his intellect could soar. Yet even this success stirred something dangerous within him, a growing pride, a hunger not simply to know but to be admired for knowing, to shine rather than to serve. At the same time, Carthage exposed him to passions and pleasures that his quiet life in Tagaste and Madaris had never prepared him for. Augustine found himself drawn into the world of youthful friendships marked by lively competitions, late-night celebrations, and a certain reckless joy that seemed harmless at first, but soon became a part of him. He made companions whose ideas, humor, and mischief delighted him, and together they explored the margins of what was considered respectable. They spurred one another on, celebrating moments of boldness that Augustine would later recall with both fondness and regret. For it was here, amid the noise of Carthage, that he began to wander more deliberately into the realm of desires he had once approached only timidly. The shift was subtle at first, a stolen moment of curiosity here, a lingering glance there, but slowly these became habits, then patterns, then elements of a life he accepted as his own. Augustine fell deeply in love with a woman whose name he never revealed, and the relationship brought him both joy and conflict. She offered companionship, tenderness, and the comfort of intimacy, and Augustine grew to cherish her with a steady affection. Yet the bond also drew him into a life of unwed passion, something he later recognized as part of the chain that kept him from fully seeking God. Still, in the moment, he felt torn between what he knew was expected of him and what his heart insisted on experiencing. Youth, after all, often confuses desire with destiny, and Augustine was no different. There were times during these years when Augustine felt the gentle tug of the faith his mother had tried to nurture within him. He remembered her prayers, her tears, her unwavering hope for his soul. He remembered the hymns he had heard as a child, the soft light of early morning when she would kneel in silence. And sometimes, late at night, when the noise around him faded and the veil of pleasure slipped from his eyes, he felt the ache of something missing, an emptiness that no romance, no friendship, no accomplishment could soothe. But instead of turning toward the comfort of faith, he pushed further into worldly pursuits, hoping the void would eventually disappear through distraction or indulgence. During this time, Augustine read a work that deeply influenced him, Cicero's Hortensius, a philosophical text urging the reader to pursue wisdom above all else. This book awakened something powerful inside him, an urgent desire to seek truth, to understand the meaning of life, to grasp the purpose behind existence itself. The longing had always lived within him, but Cicero's words stirred it like a flame, suddenly given fresh air. It was a transformative moment, one that could have turned him toward the faith Monica cherished. But instead, Augustine sought answers elsewhere, believing Christianity too simple, too literal, too unrefined for the questions burning within him. It was this very hunger for truth that led him into the arms of the Manichaeans, a religious sect promising secret knowledge, intellectual sophistication, and a worldview that appeared to satisfy the philosophical restlessness inside him. Their teachings explained the universe as a struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, spirit and matter. Concepts Augustine found appealing, comforting even, because they seemed to explain the conflict he felt in his own heart. He embraced Manichaeanism enthusiastically, believing at last that he had found a system capable of answering his questions. He shared these beliefs with his friends, defending them with the force of his reason and the charm of his rhetorical skill. For now, he believed himself enlightened, and the idea of returning to the simple faith of his mother felt impossible. Monica, however, was devastated. The news that her beloved son had joined a sect considered heretical brought her to tears, and she prayed with renewed fervor for his conversion. She begged God to guide Augustine back to truth, to break through the illusions that clouded his judgment, to restore the faith she feared he was losing forever. Augustine, not yet ready to understand her sorrow, continued forward with the confidence of a young man convinced he had discovered a path that would bring him both knowledge and fulfillment. Yet even in the midst of his intellectual pride, Augustine experienced moments of deep contradiction. He felt an ever-growing awareness that the pleasures he pursued left him emptier afterward. His relationships, though sincere, did not give him the lasting peace he longed for. His achievements in rhetoric won admiration, but the praise faded quickly, leaving him restless once more. And the teachings of the Manichaeans, though appealing at first, began to reveal cracks, questions they could not answer, mysteries their explanations only complicated. Still, Augustine held on, unwilling to admit that his path might be flawed, unwilling to face the possibility that the truth he sought might require humility rather than brilliance. And so his youthful years unfolded like a tapestry woven from bright threads of ambition and darker threads of temptation. He was becoming a man shaped by contradictions, intellectual but impulsive, gifted but anxious, yearning for truth, yet fleeing from the very source of it. In Carthage, Augustine was learning who he was, but he was also learning who he was not. And though he did not yet understand it, every pleasure, every mistake, every moment of unrest was slowly preparing him for a far deeper awakening. As Augustine moved further into this new world of passions and philosophies, one question began to rise softly in the background of his life, like a quiet, persistent note. What becomes of a heart that knows so much, yet still feels so lost? Carrying the quiet ache of Augustine's youthful restlessness deeper into the heart of his journey, we now enter the season when he left behind the familiar shores of Carthage and stepped into the vast, pulsating life of the empire's great intellectual centers. For although he had tasted the sweetness of learning and the sharpness of desire in Carthage, he soon discovered that the world there was too small for his ambition. He needed more acclaim, more refinement, more opportunity. His talents had outgrown the classrooms that once challenged him, and his dreams stretched far beyond what the city could offer. And so, driven by equal parts hope and dissatisfaction, Augustine set his eyes upon Rome, the beating heart of rhetoric, culture, and promise, believing that there he would rise to greatness, both in skill and reputation. Yet he did not realize that the journey itself would expose another layer of the emptiness that followed him, an emptiness no city could fill. Before he could leave for Rome, a shadow had already begun to lengthen across his life in Carthage. A bitter disappointment struck when he discovered that the Manichaean teachers he depended on for answers could not withstand his questions. Augustine had approached their leader, Faustus, hoping this learned figure would resolve the doubts that had been troubling him. Yet instead of finding clarity, Augustine found a gentle man of pleasant manners but shallow understanding. Faustus, for all his charm, could not address the philosophical problems that gnawed at Augustine, could not explain the nature of evil, could not defend the worldview that had captivated the young seeker. This encounter planted the seed of disillusionment, subtle at first but destined to grow. Still, Augustine was not ready to abandon the Manichaeans entirely. Pride, habit, and fear of uncertainty kept him bound. He simply tucked his doubts into a quiet corner of his mind, telling himself that Rome might offer answers where Carthage had failed. The decision to leave Carthage was not easy, particularly because it meant leaving behind the woman with whom he had shared so many tender years. Their relationship, though not blessed by marriage, had brought him stability and affection, a sense of being known and cared for in the midst of his ambitions. She had borne him a son, a Deodatus, whose name meant given by God, a boy who would later become one of the brightest joys of Augustine's life. Yet when the opportunity arose to pursue a prestigious teaching career in Rome, Augustine chose ambition over the life they had built. With sorrow in her eyes and a heartbreak Augustine would only later understand, she returned to Africa with their son, while Augustine boarded a ship for Italy, carrying within him a longing for greatness and an unspoken grief that would quietly follow him. The journey across the sea was long, and Augustine endured much hardship as he traveled, but the sight of Rome rising before him filled him with renewed determination. This was the city he had imagined for years, the center of learning, the home of orators whose voices shaped hearts and senate halls alike. Yet upon arriving, Augustine quickly discovered that Rome was not as noble as he had imagined. He found students who cared more about deceit than discipline, who admired rhetoric but refused to pay their teachers, who played tricks on newcomers and delighted in their frustration. Augustine, who had come seeking honor and excellence, instead encountered a world of manipulation and unpredictability. His first months in Rome were marked by disillusionment, illness, and a growing awareness that the dreams he had chased were beginning to slip through his fingers. But just as despair threatened to settle upon him, an opportunity arrived that seemed to promise the success he had long desired. A position opened in Milan, where he could serve as a professor of rhetoric under the patronage of the emperor's court. Milan was not only a city of learning, but also a city of influence, where philosophers, statesmen, and bishops mingled in vibrant exchange. To be appointed there was an honor beyond anything Augustine had yet achieved, and with renewed hope he accepted the role, believing it would offer him the stability and prestige he had craved since youth. The journey from Rome to Milan marked another turning point in Augustine's life. For the first time, he found himself stepping into a world where Christianity was not simply a distant belief held by his mother or practiced quietly by a few. In Milan, Christianity flourished openly, shaping public life and drawing the attention of the brightest minds of the age. Religious debates, theological discussions, and moral questions stirred the atmosphere like a steady hum. And at the center of this spiritual energy stood one man whose presence would change Augustine's life forever, Bishop Ambrose. Before Augustine's arrival in Milan, he had heard whispers of Ambrose's reputation, a man of learning, a gifted speaker, a leader respected for his courage and compassion. Augustine, still seeking truth yet clinging to pride, was curious. He wanted to hear the man whose name filled the conversations of scholars, who commanded the respect of both the faithful and the skeptical. And so, on one quiet day, Augustine entered the basilica to listen, expecting a performance of rhetorical skill, but not a stirring of the soul. What he found instead was something entirely unexpected. Ambrose spoke with a gentleness that disarmed, a clarity that pierced through confusion, and a warmth that invited even the uncertain to draw near. His voice did not flash with theatrics or flourish, yet it carried a depth that Augustine had not encountered in any of his Manichaean teachers. Augustine returned again and again, at first out of admiration for Ambrose's rhetorical mastery, but slowly because something deeper was stirring. He began to realize that Scripture, which he had once dismissed as simplistic, carried a richness he had never known how to see. Under Ambrose's guidance, the words of the prophets and the teachings of the apostles opened themselves like quiet windows into worlds Augustine had never imagined. He felt the walls of his heart tremble, though he fought fiercely against the idea that the Christian faith might hold the truth he had spent years chasing through philosophy and desire. Yet as this inner tension grew, Augustine found himself living in a household shaped by a gentle yet powerful influence. Monica, who had followed him to Milan after years of tears and prayer, joined him once more, bringing with her the same unwavering love she had offered since his childhood. She rejoiced to see him attend Ambrose's sermons, though she remained patient, knowing that conversion often arrives slowly, like dawn after a long night. She prayed beside him, prayed for him, prayed around him, filling their home with the quiet rhythm of trust. But Augustine was still not ready to surrender. Part of him still clung to the pride that had shaped his youth, believing he could find truth on his own terms. He continued his teaching, impressed students, and enjoyed the social reputation Milan afforded him. He even entered into a socially advantageous engagement, arranged to elevate his status. Yet beneath these outward achievements, an invisible struggle raged within him. He felt torn between the teachings of Ambrose and the whispers of old desires, between Monica's prayers and the proud habits he had cultivated, between the longing for truth and the fear of what truth might demand. And so, in Milan, Augustine lived with one foot in the world of God and one still clinging to the world of self. His heart was still divided, but the cracks were widening. The teachings of Ambrose had awakened something fragile but real. Monica's presence surrounded him with steady love, and the old explanations that once satisfied him now rang hollow. He felt himself drifting toward a threshold, one he did not yet know how to cross. In this quiet but profound tension, Augustine began asking a question he had avoided all his life. What if the truth he had been searching for was not found through brilliance, but through surrender? Carrying the soft tension of Augustine's early years in Milan, we now move gently into a chapter where the battle between his mind and his heart began to deepen, stretching him in ways he could no longer ignore. For although he had come to Milan seeking honor and professional success, he found instead a quiet unraveling of the certainties he once clung to so fiercely. The teachings of the Manichaeans that once seemed so polished and profound now felt thin beneath his questioning gaze. The pleasures he once relied on to soothe his heart now left him restless, and the steady presence of Ambrose alongside the constant prayers of Monica slowly drew him toward a light he had spent years trying to outthink. It is often in such seasons, when the soul begins to tire of its own wandering, that the first seeds of renewal take root, even if the one who receives them does not yet recognize their growth. In Milan, Augustine continued to teach rhetoric with the brilliance that had always set him apart. Students admired him. Colleagues respected him. But in the quiet hours between lessons, when the applause had faded and the bustle of the city settled into silence, he felt a growing sense that his life had become divided into two selves, one public, one hidden. The public Augustine shone with confidence, elegance, and intellectual strength, but the hidden Augustine carried a weight he could neither name nor cast aside. Old anxieties pressed upon him, whispering that success without meaning was hollow, that knowledge without truth was fragile, that desire without love was empty. Yet, like many who sense the stirrings of grace before they understand it, Augustine tried to outrun these whispers by immersing himself ever more deeply in work, friendships, and philosophical study. The Manichaean doctrines that had once enthralled him now became a source of frustration. He pressed their teachers for answers about the nature of evil, about the structure of the universe, about the problems that had always troubled his mind. But instead of clarity, he found evasion. Their explanations seemed clever but incomplete, their theories intricate but fragile. With each passing month, Augustine felt the scaffolding of Manichaean thought weaken beneath him, like a beautifully crafted building with no solid foundation. He was too honest with himself to pretend he did not see the flaws, yet too uncertain to abandon the only system he believed had guided him through his youth. Still, beneath these intellectual struggles, the deeper conflict was spiritual. Monica, ever faithful, saw her son's turmoil with the eyes of a mother who had prayed too long to be deceived. She understood that the battle was not simply between philosophies, but between pride and grace, between Augustine's desire to control his destiny and God's desire to remake his heart. She prayed with tears, fasted with quiet resolve, and attended Mass daily, offering Augustine's life as though placing it gently, again and again, into the hands of the one she trusted. Her presence in Milan became a living testament to the faith Augustine had tried so long to escape. As his confusion grew, Augustine sought intellectual refuge in the works of various philosophers. He explored the teachings of the academics, whose skepticism challenged him to question everything he believed. He studied the doctrines of the Stoics, impressed by their discipline yet troubled by their lack of tenderness. He admired the Neoplatonists, who spoke of a world ordered by divine reason, whose vision of the soul striving toward the one stirred something deep within him. Their writings lifted his mind toward beauty and truth, but they offered no path for his heart to be healed. They spoke of ascent but not mercy, of enlightenment but not love, of perfection but not the embrace of a personal God. Still, they moved him closer, closer to the edge of faith, closer to the recognition that his deepest hunger was not for knowledge, but for grace. And slowly, quietly, Augustine began to see that Christianity, which he had once dismissed, held within it a depth he had never before understood. It was through Ambrose that these insights began to take shape. The bishop's sermons, delivered with a tone both gentle and authoritative, carried a wisdom that spoke to Augustine's mind while also softening his heart. He listened not only to Ambrose's words but also to his life, a life marked by humility, clarity, and charity. In Ambrose, Augustine saw for the first time a union of intellect and holiness, a blending of reason and love that he had never believed possible. The scriptures, too, began to open themselves to him, though at first only partially. Under Ambrose's guidance, Augustine discovered that the sacred texts were not meant to be interpreted literally in every detail, but carried deeper spiritual meanings, hidden like treasures beneath the surface. The harsh passages he once mocked now revealed beauty. The mysteries he once scorned now invited his contemplation. A quiet transformation was beginning, subtle but unmistakable. And yet Augustine resisted. He felt himself drawn toward the truth he had spent years opposing, but he feared what acceptance would demand. To embrace Christianity meant surrendering not only his old beliefs, but also the pleasures, ambitions, and habits that had become part of his very identity. There was still the matter of his desire, which clung to him like a vine that refused to release its hold. The idea of chastity frightened him deeply. He feared the loss of affection, the loss of intimacy, the loss of comfort. He feared the loneliness that he imagined would follow, and so he told himself that he could not yet commit, that perhaps he could admire Christianity from a distance without stepping fully into its demands. In these fears, Augustine revealed the deepest struggle of the human heart, the longing for God held hostage by the longing for everything else. The months passed, and the inner conflict only intensified. Augustine's engagement, arranged for social advancement, became a source of sorrow when he realized the girl was too young to marry for several years. The arrangement dissolved, and Augustine sent away the woman he had lived with for more than a decade. A painful decision, born more of social expectation than spiritual conviction. Her departure broke something inside him. She returned to Africa, vowing never to love another man, while Augustine found himself grieving not only her absence, but also the part of himself that had been tied to her. His son, Adeodatus, stayed with him, a quiet reminder of the love they had shared. Left alone with his thoughts, Augustine felt more restless than ever. He wandered through gardens, paced the streets of Milan, and sought conversations with friends who could not quiet the storm inside him. One friend, Alypius, remained by his side, sharing in his struggles, listening with patience, offering companionship when words failed. Yet even this faithful presence could not dispel the growing truth. Augustine was being drawn toward God, and no earthly comfort could shield him from the pull. One summer afternoon, Augustine found himself pondering, as he often did, the question that had begun to haunt him. How long would he resist grace? He felt caught between two selves, one longing for truth, the other clinging to habit, one yearning for freedom, the other afraid of change. He had reached the edge of a threshold but lacked the courage to step across it. In this fragile moment, he began to sense that the question was not simply whether Christianity was true, but whether he was willing to let himself be transformed by it. And so, with his soul trembling between fear and longing, Augustine moved slowly toward a moment that would change not only his life, but the course of Christian history. For the first time in many years, he asked himself quietly, almost in a whisper, what if surrender, not success, was the path he had been seeking all along? Carrying the trembling question that had begun to rise within Augustine's soul, we now move into the unfolding of a chapter where ambition, longing, and inner turmoil push him toward a breaking point he can no longer ignore. For although he had found esteem and intellectual command in Milan, and though the world around him admired his brilliance, something within him remained painfully incomplete. His restlessness no longer came in short, passing waves. It had become a tide that swept through every corner of his spirit. Each success left him emptier, each pleasure left him lonelier, each philosophical insight left him aching for something more. And the more he tried to steady himself with his own strength, the more he discovered that his strength was not enough. It was in this season, fragile, uncertain, and interior, that the quiet workings of grace began to draw Augustine toward a decisive moment, one that would expose all he had been running from. In the midst of this growing unease, Augustine continued teaching rhetoric, fulfilling the responsibilities of his prestigious position in Milan. His lectures were admired for their fluidity and brilliance. Students often crowded the hall to hear him speak. Yet even while performing with mastery, he sometimes felt as though his own words were drifting past him. He could teach others how to persuade, how to argue, how to shape language into power, but he could not speak peace into his own heart. There were nights when he returned home exhausted, his voice still echoing with the sounds of applause, yet his heart falling silent with an unfamiliar heaviness. Success had become a room without windows. His personal life, too, had grown increasingly complex. After sending away the woman who had been his companion for many years, the mother of his beloved son, Augustine attempted to follow the expectations placed on him by society. He entered into another romantic relationship, one intended to bridge the loneliness left behind. Yet this too soon caught fire with passion, repeating the same cycle of attachment and guilt he had known before. He felt drawn to love, and yet resisted the vulnerability it required. He longed for closeness, yet feared being bound by it. In this tension, Augustine began to see more clearly than ever that the desires of the heart were not easily mastered, and that freedom without direction could become a chain disguised as liberty. At the same time, the philosophical systems he once relied on for guidance continued to crumble beneath him. The Manichaeans had already lost their hold on him, unable to withstand his scrutiny. The skepticism of the academics, which had offered him temporary refuge, soon felt too cold, too empty, too dismissive of the deep hunger for purpose that had begun to swell within him. The Neoplatonists awakened his longing for transcendence, but they provided no figure to love, no compassion to cling to, no story that embraced the wounds of the human condition. Their teachings lifted the mind but left the heart untouched. Augustine admired them, learned from them, but could not rest in them. And so he continued to wander, through philosophies, through relationships, through ambitions, searching for something solid, something gentle, something true. He found himself drawn more frequently to the sermons of Ambrose. The bishop's voice had become a quiet lifeline, soothing Augustine in the places where reason could not reach. Ambrose spoke of Christ not only as a truth to be believed, but as a presence to be encountered. The scriptures, illuminated through Ambrose's teaching, opened to Augustine like pages warm with light. Stories he once mocked now felt strangely intimate, as if they were echoing something already inscribed in the deepest part of his heart. Yet even as he drew closer to faith intellectually, Augustine felt held back by the same fear that had haunted him for years. The fear of giving up his desires, the fear of losing the pleasures that had shaped so much of his life. He often confessed that he wanted chastity, but not yet. He wanted purity, but feared its demands. He wanted peace, but not at the cost of the habits he had woven into himself. And so he lived in a painful tension, drawn to God yet chained to the life he feared to release. It was during this time that Augustine began spending long hours with two close friends, Alypius, who had accompanied him through many intellectual turns, and Nebridius, whose steady character offered him gentle support. These friends, too, wrestled with questions of meaning, truth, and virtue. Their conversations often stretched deep into the night, weaving together strands of philosophy, personal longing, and spiritual curiosity. Alypius, in particular, shared Augustine's struggle with chastity, and their shared weakness made their friendship both tender and challenging. Each saw in the other a reflection of the same invisible battle. They comforted one another with honesty, yet also witnessed in each other the futility of resisting the call that whispered from the depths of their souls. In the midst of these intimate friendships, Augustine's son, Adeodatus, grew into a bright, thoughtful child whose presence touched Augustine with a love that often startled him. The boy's intelligence was remarkable, his nature gentle and pure. In moments when Augustine held him or watched him play, he felt a longing for stability, for a life rooted in goodness, for a foundation he could offer his son. Yet he also felt the weight of his own inconsistencies. How could he guide a child when he himself felt so lost? How could he teach virtue when he wandered so far from it? These questions did not condemn him, but they stirred something soft and longing in his heart, an early, quiet desire to become the kind of man his son could trust. But the most significant influence during this restless period remained Monica. Her presence was steady as the sunrise. She prayed for Augustine without ceasing, carried him in her heart with unwavering faith, and believed with absolute certainty that God's mercy would someday break through his resistance. She spoke to him not with pressure, but with patience, reminding him gently of the truths she cherished. Her love was not forceful, yet it was a force, one that Augustine could not escape, even when he tried. And there were days when he admitted privately, even reluctantly, that her faith felt more solid than all the philosophies he had studied. As Augustine moved deeper into this fragile time, a turning point approached without him recognizing it. He felt increasingly exhausted by the double life he lived, increasingly disillusioned with the world's promises. He sought advice from Ambrose, from friends, from books, yet found himself more confused rather than less. He confessed to Alypius that he knew the truth was calling him, but lacked the will to follow it. He felt trapped between two forces, God drawing him gently forward and his own desires pulling him backward. The tension grew until it felt like a storm forming inside him, gathering weight and momentum. This inner storm reached its breaking point one afternoon as Augustine sat with Alypius in the privacy of his home. A friend named Pontitianus visited unexpectedly and began telling them a story about two men who, upon reading the life of Saint Anthony, had abandoned their worldly careers to devote themselves entirely to God. Augustine listened in stunned silence as Pontitianus described their sudden conversion, their courage, their surrender. Something inside him cracked open. He felt both admiration and shame. Admiration for their courage, shame for his own fear. Why could others leap into faith while he lingered in indecision? When Pontitianus left, Augustine felt overwhelmed. A flood of emotion surged within him, sorrow, longing, fear, and a deep, aching recognition that he could not continue as he had. He spoke to Alypius in broken sentences, confessing his weakness, admitting his fears, lamenting his divided heart. He felt torn apart by the battle between his desires and the call of God, unable to remain where he was, yet terrified to change. And so, with trembling steps, Augustine rose and fled to the garden outside his home, unable to contain the storm any longer. Alypius followed quietly, sensing that something sacred was unfolding. There, surrounded by the rustling of leaves and the gentle stillness of afternoon, Augustine felt himself collapse, not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, utterly. All his striving, all his pride, all his years of seeking came crashing into this single moment of exhaustion and desperate need. He pressed his hands to his face, sinking beneath the weight of his own helplessness, and for the first time, he stopped running. The question rose again within him, not as a whisper now, but as a cry. How long, O Lord? How long will I fear surrender? Carrying the trembling cry of Augustine's heart into a new and deeper stillness, we now enter the moment toward which his entire life had been quietly moving, though he never knew it. For all the wandering of his youth, all the restless seeking, all the mistakes and confusions that shaped his journey had been slowly leading him toward a threshold he could neither predict nor escape. When he stepped into the garden that afternoon, heart racing, mind unraveling, soul aching beneath the strain of opposing desires, Augustine was not yet aware that he was approaching a moment that would alter the course of his life completely. It would come not through philosophy, nor through argument, nor through intellectual mastery, but through the simple, disarming movement of grace, finding him exactly where he felt most broken. The garden behind the house in Milan was quiet that day, touched by sunlight filtering through the leaves of fig trees. The stillness seemed almost foreign to Augustine, who had lived so long within the noise of ambition and the clamor of his own restless mind. He had fled there in desperation, unable to bear the tension that had been building inside him. The story told by Pontitianus about those two young men who surrendered their lives to God weighted his heart like a stone. Their courage magnified his fear. Their clarity exposed his confusion. For years he had sought truth, yet when it finally shone near him, he found himself terrified by its brightness. As he paced along the garden path, Augustine felt as though he were being torn in two. On one side stood the life he had built, the habits of desire, the attachments that comforted him, the ambitions that defined him, the pride that shaped his identity. On the other side stood the call of God, a quiet, persistent voice that had followed him since childhood, whispered through Monica's prayers, echoed in Ambrose's sermons, stirred in the depths of his soul. He longed to answer that call, yet he felt trapped by his own weakness. His thoughts spiraled wildly. He felt anger at himself, shame for his failures, sorrow for the life he felt unable to change. He even felt fear, a fear that surrendering to God would demand more than he could offer, that turning toward holiness would mean giving up the very things that had held him together for so long. His tears came unbidden, falling like rain he could not stop. Alypius stood nearby, silent, understanding that this was not a moment for words. It was a moment between Augustine and the one who had been waiting for him all these years. In the midst of this turmoil, Augustine suddenly felt himself overcome by emotion so intense that he withdrew even deeper into the garden, sinking beneath a fig tree as if the world were collapsing around him. There he wept openly, not the careful tears of sorrow he had shed before, but a breaking open of everything he had held inside. His heart poured itself out in a cry that rose not from intellect, but from the fragile center of his being. He begged God for help, for mercy, for strength. He confessed aloud that he was powerless to change without grace. "Why not now?" he cried. "Why do I say tomorrow and tomorrow? Why not this very moment put an end to my shame?" The words echoed through the garden as though spoken into eternity. And then, just when the weight of sorrow seemed to press too heavily upon him, Augustine heard something unexpected. A voice, high, clear, childlike. It came from beyond the garden wall, perhaps from a neighboring home, perhaps from a child at play. He could not tell, but he heard it distinctly. "Take and read, take and read." The phrase struck him like sunlight breaking suddenly through clouds. Take and read. He had never heard a child's game include such words. It was not a phrase children used. It felt spoken not to the air but to him, spoken with purpose, spoken with tenderness, spoken with the quiet authority of grace. He rose quickly, trembling, and returned to the bench where he had set down the scriptures he carried with him. His tears were still wet on his face as he opened the book at random, trusting the voice, trusting the moment, trusting that God had led him here. The first words his eyes fell upon came from the letter to the Romans. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in immorality and shamelessness, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh. Augustine read the passage as though it had been written directly into the depths of his soul. Every word pierced the illusions he had clung to, stripped away the excuses he had repeated, illuminated the path he had been too frightened to see. It felt as though God himself were speaking to him, not condemning him, but inviting him, calling him to step out of the darkness he had lived in and into a new light that promised freedom. In that instant, a quiet miracle took place. Augustine later wrote that his heart was flooded with light, and that all the doubts he had wrestled with for years simply melted away. The chains he believed unbreakable were suddenly gone. The desires that held him captive lost their power. The fears that haunted him were lifted. His soul, so long restless, found a stillness he had never known. He closed the book gently, holding it to his chest as though holding the very presence of God. Alypius, sensing the transformation, approached him, and Augustine shared the passage he had read. Alypius then opened the scriptures himself and found words that mirrored Augustine's revelation. It was a moment of shared grace, a moment that would bind their friendship in holiness for the rest of their lives. Augustine's tears changed then, from sorrow to relief, from fear to gratitude. He felt himself breathe in a new way, as if the air around him had always been there, but he had never truly inhaled it before. In that garden, beneath the fig tree, the restless young seeker encountered the God who had been seeking him all along. When Augustine returned to the house, Monica saw the change immediately. A mother's heart knows. The light in his eyes, the peace in his movements, the softness in his voice. It was as though the son she had prayed for had finally come home. She wept tears of joy, embracing him not as the brilliant scholar he had become, but as the beloved child she had carried in her prayers for decades. In the days that followed, Augustine informed his friends and supporters that he would resign from his position as professor of rhetoric. The ambitions that once consumed him now felt small. He longed for a life of contemplation, for prayer, for truth unshackled by pride. He began preparing for baptism, a journey that would reshape every part of him. And while the path ahead would include sorrow and sacrifice, Augustine now walked with a heart rooted in grace. The storm had passed, not all at once perhaps, but enough that he could feel the horizon opening before him, clear and filled with the quiet promise of a new beginning. And so the garden moment became the turning point, the place where the restless heart finally discovered that surrender, not striving, was the doorway into peace. Carrying the radiant stillness of the garden moment into the unfolding of Augustine's new life, we now move gently into a chapter shaped not by sudden revelation, but by the slow, steady work of grace as it begins to reorder the heart from within. For although the moment beneath the fig tree had broken the chains that bound him, Augustine soon learned that conversion is not a single event, but a journey. A movement from darkness into light that continues long after the first dawn has risen. The path ahead would require humility, surrender, patience, and a willingness to let go of old ways in order to embrace the quiet beauty of a life shaped by God. This was the beginning of Augustine's transformation, the start of a pilgrimage that would lead him through sorrow, healing, and profound joy. In the days following his conversion, Augustine felt as though he had stepped into a world both familiar and entirely new. Everything around him seemed touched by gentler colors. The sky above Milan, the quiet streets, the simple meals shared with loved ones, even the rhythm of his thoughts. Yet it was not simply the world that had changed. It was Augustine himself. Where once he had felt restless, he now sensed a soft undercurrent of peace. Where once he had been torn between countless desires, he now felt a steady pull toward a single truth. and where once he had feared surrender, he now felt a quiet gratitude that surrender had found him. The first outward sign of his inner transformation came through a decision that startled many who admired him. Augustine resigned from his prestigious position as professor of rhetoric, stepping away from the career that had defined so much of his identity. He announced that he could no longer teach the art of persuasion in service of worldly ambitions, for he wished now to devote his words to the search for God. This decision, though courageous, was not easy. It meant stepping away from financial security, from public honor, and from the admiration of students who had looked to him as a model of intellectual success. Yet Augustine felt no regret. His heart, once swollen with pride, now longed for a life of contemplation, prayer, and truth. He withdrew from public life and took refuge in a quiet villa outside Milan, accompanied by a small circle of companions: Alypius, his steadfast friend; Nebridius, a gentle and disciplined soul; and his beloved son Adeodatus, whose bright innocence brought Augustine tender joy. Monica, too, joined them, her heart overflowing with gratitude as she watched her son walk the path she had prayed for all her life. Together they formed a small community devoted to study, reflection, and spiritual preparation. Their days were marked by conversations on virtue, the nature of the soul, the goodness of God, and the hidden workings of grace. Augustine wrote, prayed, and allowed his heart to be reshaped, letting go of the attachments that once bound him. One of the most meaningful aspects of this period was Augustine's deepening relationship with Adeodatus. The boy, only a young teenager, revealed a mind astonishingly mature for his age. Augustine often marveled at his son's insight, humility, and gentle spirit. In moments when they read scripture together or spoke about the mysteries of faith, Augustine felt both humbled and uplifted. He saw in Adeodatus not only the beauty of youth, but the quiet work of grace forming a soul with purity and clarity. Their conversations would later be preserved in Augustine's writings, a tender testament to the profound connection between father and son. And though Augustine did not know it then, these days with Adeodatus would become some of the most precious memories of his life. Yet even as he found peace in this small community, Augustine sensed another task waiting for him. He knew that if he wished to walk fully into the life God had prepared for him, he would need to lay aside not only his old beliefs, but also the fears and wounds that had shaped him. This meant confronting his past with honesty, his mistakes, his pride, his desires, and the sorrow he carried for sending away the woman he had loved for so many years. He did not deny the pain this caused him. Instead, he allowed grace to enter the grief, trusting that God heals even the wounds we inflict on ourselves. And slowly, gently, Augustine began to understand that God's mercy was large enough to hold every part of him, even the parts he wished had been different. During this season of retreat, Augustine began writing with renewed purpose. He composed dialogues with his friends, exploring philosophical and theological themes in a spirit of peace rather than ambition. His words flowed not from pride, but from awe, an awe that grew stronger each time he contemplated the goodness of God. He reflected on the nature of knowledge, the meaning of happiness, and the beautiful truth that the human soul was created for union with its Creator. Writing became for Augustine a form of prayer, a way of placing his thoughts before God like offerings of gratitude. Soon the time approached for one of the most significant milestones of his life, baptism. Augustine, Alypius, and the young Adeodatus all prepared together, studying scripture, praying, fasting, and seeking to purify their hearts. Easter drew near, and with it came a sense that something beautiful and irrevocable was unfolding within them. Monica watched with tears of joy, often standing silently at the doorway of their small prayer space, overwhelmed by the sight of her son and grandson preparing to give their lives fully to God. When the night of the Easter Vigil arrived, the basilica in Milan glowed with candlelight. The faithful gathered, their voices rising in hymns of hope. Augustine stepped forward, his heart trembling with a mixture of humility and gratitude. Ambrose stood before him, the bishop whose words had first awakened him to the deeper meaning of Scripture. In the waters of baptism, Augustine felt the full weight of his past lifted from him, replaced by the gentle warmth of God's forgiveness. Alypius and Adeodatus followed, their faces radiant in the light of the candles. It was a night of rebirth, the kind Monica had prayed for since her son was a child. After their baptism, the small community returned to their villa, spending the following months in quiet reflection. Augustine felt as though he were learning to breathe anew. The Scriptures, now read with the eyes of faith, opened to him with astonishing clarity. The sacraments, once foreign, became the lifeline of his soul. The Eucharist, in particular, moved him deeply. To receive the body and blood of Christ filled him with a tenderness he could neither describe nor contain. It was here, in the mystery of the altar, that Augustine began to understand the depth of God's love, not as an idea to study, but as a presence to embrace. As he continued to grow in faith, Augustine felt a new desire beginning to stir within him, the desire to return home. After years of wandering, years of searching for meaning in distant cities, he felt called to bring his newfound peace back to North Africa, to Tagaste, to the land of his childhood, to the place where his journey had first begun. Monica received the news with joy, believing that their return would be the final chapter in the prayer she had carried for so long. Yet even as they prepared to leave Milan, Augustine sensed that this journey home would carry both joy and sorrow. He did not know what awaited him, but he trusted that the grace which had brought him through the darkest parts of his life would continue to guide his steps. And so, with his heart newly awakened and his soul newly washed in the waters of rebirth, Augustine turned his gaze toward the familiar shores of Africa, carrying with him the quiet promise of a life remade from within. Carrying the gentle glow of Augustine's baptism into the next delicate stretch of his journey, we now follow him as he leaves behind the bustling world of Milan and turns his face toward the homeland that shaped his earliest memories. Yet this return to Africa, which he hoped would be a peaceful continuation of the new life he had embraced, would instead become a pilgrimage marked by profound tenderness and heartbreaking loss. For sometimes, just as the soul begins to rest in grace, life unfolds in ways that test the depth of that surrender. Augustine was about to discover that the God who had claimed his heart would guide him not only through clarity and joy, but also through the sacred weight of sorrow. When Augustine, his son Adeodatus, his friend Alypius, and the ever-faithful Monica made their plans to leave Milan, there was a sense of quiet anticipation among them. The small community they had formed felt like a family knit together by grace. Augustine dreamed of establishing a simple monastic life once they reached Tagaste, a place where he and his companions might live in prayer, study, and service, away from the ambitions that had once entangled his spirit. Monica, who had followed him across seas and cities, felt her heart nearly overflowing with gratitude. She had lived long enough to see her son not only freed from error, but filled with love for God. Now she longed for the peace of home, where she imagined spending her remaining years in the gentle company of her son and grandson. The journey from Milan began with this hopeful sense of completion, as though life were settling into a soft, expected rhythm. Augustine carried with him the memories of the garden, the waters of baptism, and the mornings of quiet prayer shared with those he loved. Yet beneath this peace, he carried a growing awareness that he was stepping into a future he could not foresee. It was a quiet awareness, not a fear, but a kind of spiritual attentiveness, an understanding that God often writes the next chapter in shadows before revealing it in light. When they arrived at the port of Ostia near Rome, they found themselves with a few days' wait before their ship to Africa would depart. Ostia, though close to the great capital, carried an atmosphere of gentle calm compared to the restless pace of Rome. The coastline stretched with soft winds, the water moving with a quiet, steady rhythm. It was here, in this place of simple stillness, that one of the most tender and unforgettable moments of Augustine's life unfolded, an encounter that would become etched into the heart of the Christian world through the pages of his Confessions. One evening, Augustine sat beside his mother in a quiet room overlooking a small courtyard. The air was still, touched by a soft breeze coming through the window. They spoke together, not about worldly matters, nor about travel plans, nor even about the trials they had overcome, but about heaven. They wondered aloud what eternal life would be like, what joy awaited the souls of the faithful, what beauty lay in the presence of God. The conversation flowed with a sense of deep intimacy, as though the veil between earth and heaven had thinned just enough for them to peer through. Augustine would later describe this moment as an ascent of the soul, a foretaste of eternity shared between a mother and her son, two hearts fully surrendered to God. Monica's eyes shone with quiet happiness as she listened to him speak. She had followed him through years of wandering, prayed for him through seasons of heartbreak, and rejoiced at his conversion. Now, sitting with him in that gentle twilight, she felt her mission coming to an end. With a soft smile, she told Augustine something he would remember for the rest of his life. "Son, nothing in this world gives me delight anymore. I do not know what I have left to do, or why I am still here. All my hopes in this life have been fulfilled." Augustine felt a tender warmth toward her, believing that her words were just expressions of joy, but in truth they were also a quiet farewell. Shortly after this holy conversation, Monica fell ill. At first the fever seemed mild, something that rest might soothe, but within days it grew stronger. Her strength faded, her breathing weakened, and the realization settled upon Augustine and the others that she was nearing her earthly end. Augustine was struck with sorrow. Though he knew his mother belonged to God, the thought of losing her filled him with grief he had not expected. She had been the steady presence guiding him since childhood, the voice of prayer, the heart of faith, the anchor of his wandering soul. Yet Monica herself faced her approaching death with serenity. She did not cling to life, nor did she express fear. Instead, she spoke with a peaceful certainty that the God who had guided her across continents to bring her son home to faith was now calling her into the eternal home prepared for her. When asked whether she feared being buried far from her homeland, she answered with simple trust, "Nothing is far from God." Augustine stayed by her bedside as her final days unfolded, holding her hand, listening to her soft voice, and feeling the weight of emotion wash over him like a tide. She offered him her final blessing, urging him to remember her each time he approached the altar, and expressing her confidence that he would continue walking the path of holiness now illuminated before him. Her final words were gentle, filled with the same motherly faith that had carried him through every trial. "Lay this body anywhere. Do not let care for it trouble you. Only one thing do I ask, that you remember me at the Lord's table wherever you are." With those final expressions of peace, Monica closed her eyes and surrendered her spirit to God. Augustine felt the moment like a quiet breaking, a sorrow too deep for words, yet touched by a holiness that made the room feel filled with silent light. He wept, not ashamed of his tears, for he had loved her deeply, and she had been the greatest instrument of God's mercy in his life. Yet even in his grief, he felt gratitude for the beauty of her passing, a death not marked by fear or regret, but by the serenity of a soul returning to the one she had sought with all her heart. Monica was buried there in Ostia, not far from the place where she had spoken of heaven with her son. And though Augustine carried sorrow with him as he prepared to continue his journey, he also carried something deeper, a sense that his mother's prayers had not ended with her life, but now surrounded him in an even more mysterious and powerful way. When finally the time came to board the ship for Africa, Augustine stepped aboard with a heart both heavy and strengthened. The loss of his mother had carved a tender space within him, a space where compassion, humility, and a deeper love for God began to take root. He felt, perhaps for the first time, that holiness often grows most profoundly in the soil of sorrow. As the ship moved across the waters, carrying him back to Tagaste, Augustine watched the horizon with quiet reverence. He knew he was returning home without the mother who had been the compass of his earthly life, yet he also knew that her spirit would guide him still. And in his heart, shaped now by both conversion and grief, a new question began to rise. Gentle, insistent, hopeful. What kind of life would he build in the land where his story first began, now that his heart belonged wholly to God? Carrying the tender sorrow of Monica's passing as a quiet, steady ache within him, Augustine stepped back onto African soil not as the restless youth who had once departed in search of ambition, but as a man reshaped by grace, chastened by loss, and awakened to a calling he did not yet fully understand. Tagaste embraced him with familiar landscapes, olive trees bending in the warm breeze, dusty roads winding through the fields, the murmured rhythms of village life that had once framed his childhood days. Yet everything felt different now, for the heart that returned was not the heart that had left. Augustine had come home as a seeker who had finally found the source of the peace he longed for, and he carried within him a quiet determination to build his life around that peace, nurturing it, sharing it, letting it grow. In those first weeks back in Tagaste, Augustine allowed himself to rest. He spent long hours in prayer, sometimes walking through the fields where he had played as a child, sometimes sitting quietly in a small room of the family home, reflecting on all that God had done for him. Memories rose and fell like gentle waves. The mischievous boy learning his letters in Tagaste's small school, the ambitious youth drawn to Carthage's bright lights, the troubled thinker wrestling with philosophies in Rome, the restless young man kneeling in the garden in Milan. All these parts of his story came together now, forming a path he could finally see clearly, a path traced not by his own striving, but by God's persistent mercy. With the support of his close companions, Augustine began to form the community he had dreamed of, a small household dedicated to prayer, study, and service. Alypius joined him, as did several other friends who had watched his journey with admiration and tenderness. They lived simply, sharing meals, reading scripture, engaging in long conversations about virtue, grace, and the mysteries of God. Their home became a refuge for many in Tagaste, a place where seekers found guidance, where the poor found assistance, and where the weary found a listening ear. Augustine's heart, which had once been pulled in 1,000 directions, now felt anchored by a sense of purpose that grew stronger each day. These early months of community life were marked by profound spiritual fruitfulness, yet they were also shadowed by a sorrow that Augustine carried quietly, his grief for Adeodatus. The boy, brilliant and gentle, had been Augustine's joy and pride, but shortly after their return to Africa, Adeodatus fell ill. Despite Augustine's prayers and tender care, the young boy died, leaving his father's heart aching with a pain only deep love can leave behind. Augustine mourned him with tears that flowed not from despair, but from a love that recognized the gift God had given him in his son's brief but luminous life. He entrusted Adeodatus to God with a father's humble faith, believing that the boy whose intelligence had touched him so profoundly was now held in a light far brighter than anything earth could offer. The deaths of both his mother and his son within such a short span left Augustine with a sense of life's fragility, but also with a heightened awareness of eternity. He began to write with renewed fervor, pouring into his works the wisdom he had gained through suffering and grace. His writings from this period reveal a man learning not only to think well, but to love well, a love rooted in God, tender toward others, and honest about the weaknesses of the human heart. These reflections would one day form the foundations of his great works, but for now, they served as a quiet offering of gratitude and humility. And for several years, Augustine lived this peaceful, contemplative life in Tagaste. He believed that God had called him to remain a layman, serving the church through teaching, friendship, and spiritual guidance. But God, who had woven Augustine's life through so many unexpected turns, had yet another path prepared, one that would draw him from the quiet rhythms of monastic life into the demanding world of pastoral service. The turning point came during a visit to the city of Hippo Regius, a bustling port town not far from Tagaste. Augustine traveled there with the intention of meeting a friend and perhaps finding young men willing to join his monastic community. He attended a church service, blending quietly into the congregation. But Bishop Valerius, who had heard of Augustine's reputation for holiness and learning, saw him among the people. It was common in that time for the faithful to acclaim someone they believed suitable for the priesthood. And when Valerius mentioned the need for additional clergy, the congregation suddenly turned their eyes toward Augustine. Before he could protest, they surged toward him, calling out for him to become a priest. Augustine was stunned. He had never sought such a role, and the weight of responsibility terrified him. He felt unworthy, unprepared, and deeply aware of his own faults. Tears filled his eyes as the people surrounded him with eager voices. He later said that he wept because he feared the demands and trials of the priesthood. But the church, moved by the Spirit, would not release him. And so, reluctantly, Augustine accepted the call. His ordination marked a new beginning, one filled with challenges he could not yet imagine. Bishop Valerius, recognizing Augustine's extraordinary abilities, soon made him his assistant and encouraged him to preach. Augustine took up the task with humility, addressing the congregation with a blend of clarity, gentleness, and passion that soon drew crowds to Hippo's church. He spoke not as a scholar delivering theories, but as a man who had lived the questions his listeners carried. His words touched hearts because they were shaped by his own experience of wandering and redemption. As Augustine embraced his new responsibilities, the quiet monastic life he had envisioned transformed into a life of service. He preached tirelessly, instructed catechumens, counseled the troubled, defended the faith against heresies, and worked to bring unity to divided communities. Yet even as he labored publicly, he maintained a spirit of simplicity, living with his clergy in a monastery beside the cathedral, sharing possessions, eating modestly, and praying daily with the brothers who formed his spiritual family. Augustine did not forget the early dreams of contemplation that had once filled his heart. Instead, he wove contemplation into his ministry, drawing strength from silence, scripture, and the nearness of God. The love he had learned in the hidden life of Tagaste now poured itself out in service to others, a love shaped by sorrow, deepened by grace, and refined through humility. And as Augustine slowly stepped into his calling as a shepherd of souls, he began to sense that the journey he had once resisted was becoming the very heart of who he was. The restless seeker had become a servant, the wandering son had become a spiritual father, and the man who once feared truth now carried it gently into the lives of all who sought his guidance. Yet even this was only the beginning, for the church would soon call him to an even higher task, one that would shape not only his own life, but the life of Christianity for centuries to come. And so, standing on the threshold of this new chapter, Augustine felt another quiet question rise within him. What would it mean to give not only his heart to God, but his whole life entirely, without reserve? Carrying the quiet question of total surrender gently into the next unfolding moment of his life, Augustine soon discovered that God was leading him toward responsibilities he had never sought, and a depth of service he had never imagined. For though he had accepted the priesthood with reluctance and trembling, he approached it with humility so sincere that those around him could not help but see the presence of grace shaping him day by day. And just as the early dawn gives way to full morning, Augustine's early ministry in Hippo grew into something far greater than he expected. The quiet scholar who once wished only for contemplation would soon become one of the most influential voices in the history of the Church, a shepherd whose love for his people was rooted not in ambition, but in the deep awareness that God had first loved him. Bishop Valerius, already advanced in age and weakened in health, recognized in Augustine a gift meant for more than assistance. Though Augustine himself wished only to serve quietly under Valerius's guidance, the bishop saw what Augustine could not, that God had been preparing him through every turn of his life for a larger mission. And so, moved by pastoral concern for the future of his diocese, Valerius called the clergy and people together and expressed his desire to have Augustine appointed as coadjutor bishop, ensuring that when Valerius passed, Augustine would succeed him as Bishop of Hippo. When Augustine heard this, he was seized with fear and sorrow. He felt unworthy of such a role, unprepared for such responsibility. His heart had never desired leadership. It had desired only God. Yet he also understood that the call came not through human ambition, but through the voice of the Church, guided by the Spirit. And though tears rose in his eyes at the thought of the burdens ahead, he accepted the appointment with the same humility that had carried him through every stage of his transformation. Years earlier he had prayed, "Grant me chastity, but not yet." Now he prayed, "Use me, Lord, though I am afraid." When Valerius died not long after, Augustine became the Bishop of Hippo, a role he would hold for more than 30 years. His days quickly filled with the endless tasks of ministry, preaching, teaching, settling disputes, visiting the sick, comforting the dying, feeding the poor, and guiding the faithful. Hippo was a city marked by poverty and unrest, and Augustine did not shy away from its needs. He lived among his clergy in a monastery beside the cathedral, sharing their simple meals, their prayers, and their desire to serve Christ in all things. The bishop's residence was not a place of luxury or command, but a home of community, charity, and gentle discipline. Still, Augustine's responsibilities went far beyond Hippo itself. The Church in North Africa faced numerous challenges: doctrinal disputes, divided communities, rival sects, and the lingering influence of the very beliefs Augustine himself had once followed. Donatism, a movement that questioned the legitimacy of priests who had faltered under persecution, had fractured Christian unity across the region. Augustine labored tirelessly to heal this wound, writing letters, offering guidance, engaging in public debates, and seeking reconciliation without bitterness. His words were firm yet compassionate, shaped by the memory of his own years of error. He wanted truth, but he also wanted peace. Unity not built on triumph, but on charity. In these same years, Augustine confronted another theological challenge rising from a British monk named Pelagius, whose teachings emphasized human effort over divine grace. Pelagius insisted that people could achieve holiness through their own strength, minimizing the necessity of God's assistance. Augustine recognized in this teaching a subtle but dangerous threat, for it contradicted the very essence of his own conversion. He knew from experience that the soul cannot heal itself, cannot rise to holiness by its own power, cannot escape the pull of sin through effort alone. Grace, unexpected, unearned, and freely given, was the heart of salvation. And so Augustine wrote passionately against Pelagius, defending the Church's teaching on grace with clarity, humility, and a depth of insight that would shape Christian theology for centuries to come. Yet even as he engaged in these intellectual battles, Augustine remained first and foremost a pastor. His flock saw in him not a distant scholar, but a compassionate father. He walked the streets of Hippo, greeting the elderly, comforting widows, blessing children, and sharing simple conversations with laborers. During times of hardship, he opened the monastery's doors to refugees, sharing food, water, and space with those in need. He preached not only with eloquence, but with a genuine desire to help his people understand God's nearness in their everyday lives. His sermons, rich with imagery and tenderness, reminded them that God loved them personally, watched over them intimately, and invited them constantly into deeper relationship. Throughout these years, Augustine continued to write. The pen that had once served his ambition now served God, offering reflections that blended intellect with devotion, philosophy with prayer, and theology with tender human insight. His Confessions, written not as an autobiography but as a prayer, poured from his soul with honesty, unlike anything the ancient world had seen. In its pages, he traced the wandering of his heart, the mercy that had found him, and the love that had remade him. It became a mirror for every reader longing for God, a story not only of Augustine's life, but of the universal journey from sin to grace. Later, in response to the fall of Rome, a tragedy that shook the entire empire, Augustine composed the City of God, a monumental work that offered hope in a time of fear. He reminded the faithful that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but the city of God, built not on power but on love, endures forever. His words carried the calm assurance of a man whose treasures were not tied to the shifting world, but entrusted to the God who never changes. Yet even in these great achievements, Augustine never lost the tenderness that sorrow had taught him. He remained humble, often confessing to his clergy that he felt inadequate for the burdens of his office. He prayed constantly, asking God to purify his intentions, strengthen his weaknesses, and keep him close to grace. The Eucharist remained the center of his spiritual life, an anchor of peace that nourished him for the work ahead. And whenever he approached the altar, he remembered Monica, fulfilling her last request with a love that did not diminish with years. Despite the weight of his responsibilities, Augustine found moments of quiet joy. He delighted in the laughter of children running through the streets, in the beauty of Scripture read aloud in the dim light of the basilica, in the songs of the faithful rising like incense during Easter Vigil, in the gentle companionship of the monastery brothers who prayed beside him each dawn. He believed deeply that God was present not only in grand moments, but in these small, ordinary graces, the ones that soften the heart and sustain the soul through the long work of holiness. As the years passed, Augustine's wisdom deepened. His writings spread beyond Africa, shaping the faith of countless believers. Yet the man who had once been restless now moved through his days with a quiet steadiness, knowing that his life belonged entirely to God. He was no longer the seeker who wandered through philosophies. He was the shepherd who rested in the truth. And so, as Augustine entered the later years of his ministry, another gentle question began to form in his heart, a question not filled with fear, but with peaceful anticipation. How would God bring him home when his earthly work was done? Carrying the peaceful anticipation that had begun to settle gently over Augustine's later years, we now enter the period of his life when the fullness of his vocation as bishop, shepherd, and teacher blossomed with a quiet radiance that even he could not have foreseen. For though the burdens of ministry were many, and though the challenges of defending the faith never ceased, Augustine found himself living from a center that no longer wavered, a center rooted deeply in the presence of God. His heart, once restless and divided, now moved in harmony with the one who had claimed it. Yet even as he labored tirelessly for the church, the Lord continued carving new depths of wisdom, patience, and gentleness within him, preparing him for the final stretch of his earthly pilgrimage. By this time, Augustine had become known throughout the Christian world. His letters traveled more widely than he ever had, carried by messengers across Africa, Italy, Gaul, and even distant regions of the empire. People sought him out for counsel on matters ranging from theology and scripture to marriage, justice, and moral dilemmas. He responded to each person, whether noble or poor, scholar or uneducated, with the same patient care, often writing long into the night by the dim light of a lamp. He understood that every question carried a soul behind it, and he treated each soul with reverence. For Augustine, the work of teaching was not merely an intellectual exercise, but an act of love. His preaching, too, had grown into something remarkable. While he had once spoken with the polished eloquence of a trained rhetorician, he now spoke with a humility that deepened the power of his words. Those who gathered in the Cathedral of Hippo often commented that Augustine had a way of making Scripture feel alive, as if God were speaking directly to each person in the congregation. He spoke not from a place of distant authority, but from the shared human experience of struggle, longing, repentance, and grace. Listeners found in his voice a shepherd's compassion, a father's tenderness, and a pilgrim's honesty. Yet the bishop's days were not without hardship. North Africa at the time was a land marked by political instability. The Roman Empire, once vast and formidable, was collapsing under external invasions and internal decay. Rumors of violence traveled quickly from city to city. Armies marched near and far. Refugees fled their homes in search of safety. The church itself, though spiritually strong, faced external threats and internal disputes. Augustine saw suffering all around him, hunger, fear, division, and he responded not with despair, but with even greater resolve to be a vessel of Christ's peace. The pain of the world shaped Augustine's writing in profound ways. One of the greatest challenges he faced during this period was the shock that rippled through the empire when Rome, the eternal city, the heart of civilization, fell to the Visigoths in 410. Many blamed the Christians, arguing that the abandonment of Rome's ancient gods had brought disaster. Augustine, deeply saddened by the suffering of his people, responded with one of the towering works of Christian thought, The City of God. In it, he gently guided his readers to understand that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but the kingdom of God endures. He reminded them that Christians are citizens of two cities, the earthly one that passes and the heavenly one that lasts forever. His words, written in the midst of chaos, became a beacon of hope for countless believers. Despite these immense responsibilities, Augustine never abandoned the monastic spirit that had shaped his conversion. His home remained a place of community life, where he and his fellow clergy prayed together, shared meals, and lived simply. They ate modest foods, slept on humble beds, and held no possessions as their own. Augustine insisted on this simplicity not out of severity, but out of love. He believed that those who served God's people should be free from worldly distractions. Even as bishop, he owned nothing personally. His heart, once tangled in ambition, now delighted in poverty of spirit. It was during these quieter moments of daily life that Augustine often reflected on the Eucharist, which had become the living center of his ministry. Each day, as he stood before the altar, he felt the same sense of awe that had first touched him in Milan. The mystery of Christ's presence in the sacrament filled him with a gratitude that shaped every part of his life. He saw in the Eucharist the unity of the Church, the healing of humanity, the tender nearness of the Savior who had pursued him through every season of his journey. This devotion infused his preaching, his writing, and his prayer with a gentle luminosity that touched many hearts. At times, Augustine also found himself drawn into the intimacy of prayer with a depth that startled even him. He experienced moments of contemplation when the love of God overwhelmed him, moments when words seemed too small and silence became the only fitting response. These moments reminded him that all the truths he taught, all the wisdom he wrote, all the battles he fought, found their meaning in a relationship that lay beyond intellect, the relationship between the human soul and its creator. It was this relationship that sustained him, softened him, and prepared him for the final years of his life. As Augustine grew older, the weight of his responsibilities did not diminish. If anything, they increased. New theological disputes arose, new pastoral challenges emerged, and the political tensions in North Africa worsened. Still, he approached each day with the same gentle resolve to serve God wholly, to love his people faithfully, and to speak truth with tenderness. Even in moments of exhaustion, he refused to neglect the needs of his flock. His door remained open to anyone in distress. His hands remained ready to bless, to comfort, to heal. Among the many who sought his guidance were young men drawn to the wisdom of his teaching. Augustine welcomed them with paternal warmth, encouraging them to pursue holiness with joy rather than fear. He often told them that the Christian life was not the life of the strong, but of the forgiven. God gives what God commands, he would say, and God does not command what he refuses to heal. These words became lifelines for countless souls struggling to grow in virtue. As Augustine's reputation spread, he received letters from bishops, priests, monks, and lay people across the world. Some asked for explanations of Scripture, others asked for advice on moral questions, still others sought comfort in times of loss. Augustine answered each one with patience, weaving together his profound understanding of theology with the simple compassion of a pastor who knew firsthand the wounds of the human heart. He wrote not as one above them, but as one beside them, as a fellow pilgrim touched by grace. And though he lived in a time of turmoil, Augustine maintained a deep trust in God's providence. He believed that even the world's suffering held within it a mystery that would one day reveal God's love. He encouraged his people to cling to faith even when circumstances seemed bleak, reminding them gently that nothing, not war, nor loss, nor fear, could separate them from the love of Christ. It was in these years of service, wisdom, and deepening spiritual maturity that another quiet longing began to take shape in Augustine's soul, a longing not for change, nor for rest, nor for honor, but for a deeper union with the God who had guided him from his earliest days. And so, as he continued to shepherd his flock with unwavering love, Augustine found himself drawn quietly toward the horizon of eternity, wondering not with fear, but with gentle curiosity. When the time came, how would the Lord he had served for so many years call him into his everlasting peace? Carrying the gentle curiosity of Augustine's later years into a deeper and more contemplative place, we now enter a season of his life in which the weight of years rested softly upon him, yet his spirit seemed to grow only lighter, clearer, and more filled with love. For though the world around him trembled with uncertainty and the Roman Empire continued to erode under the pressures of invasion and political collapse, Augustine's heart remained anchored in a peace that had taken decades to fully form. Every sorrow he had endured, every wandering, every loss, every moment of struggle, had been gathered into a quiet wisdom that now radiated from him like a steady flame in the midst of gathering dusk. And as he stepped slowly into the final phase of his earthly journey, the shepherd who had guided so many began to prepare for the moment when the Good Shepherd would gently lead him home. By this time, Augustine was an old man, though age had not dimmed the clarity of his thought nor the tenderness of his heart. His body carried the marks of long labor, the fatigue of endless pastoral care, the aches of years spent walking the dusty roads of Hippo, the strain of countless nights spent writing by candlelight. Yet when he rose to preach each morning, people still heard in his voice the same gentle fire that had first stirred their hearts decades earlier. Augustine himself marveled at this. He knew that the strength sustaining him did not come from his own frail body, but from the one he had come to trust completely. God, he often whispered before preaching, you are my rest, you are my courage. and then he would step before his flock with a serenity that calmed even the most troubled souls. As the years passed, Augustine felt more deeply the fragility of the world around him. North Africa, once a thriving region of the empire, began to experience profound instability. The Vandals, a Germanic people advancing through Spain and across the Mediterranean, pressed toward the African coast with increasing intensity. Towns were attacked, families were displaced, and fear spread along the streets. Augustine, always attentive to the sufferings of others, opened the doors of the monastery to refugees. Many arrived in Hippo with nothing but the clothes they wore, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief. Augustine welcomed them with gentle words, offering them not only shelter but the comfort of knowing they were not abandoned. The bishop's residence, already simple and modest, became a haven of mercy for the poor and the broken. And in the quiet hours of the night, after tending to their needs, Augustine would kneel before the tabernacle and place the entire trembling world into the hands of Christ. In these fragile times, Augustine's writings took on a new depth of longing. He wrote not to correct errors alone, nor to resolve disputes, but to strengthen the hearts of believers who felt the ground shifting beneath them. He reminded them that the city of God could not be threatened by earthly upheavals, that the love of God was stronger than violence, and that suffering, though painful, could purify the soul like fire tempering gold. He encouraged them to trust that God's providence stretched far beyond the horizon of their fear, and he prayed constantly, sometimes with words, sometimes with tears, asking the Lord to protect his people in the midst of the storms gathering around them. Despite these troubles, there were moments of profound joy that continued to grace Augustine's life. Young priests and deacons came to Hippo seeking wisdom from the elderly bishop. They sought his counsel on preaching, on prayer, on the care of souls, and Augustine received them like a father receiving his sons. He shared with them not only his knowledge of Scripture and theology, but also the gentle lessons of a life transformed by mercy. He told them that the secret to pastoral care was not eloquence or strategy, but love. Love that listens, love that forgives, love that perseveres. And he reminded them that holiness grows slowly, like a tree planted by flowing water, nourished by prayer, humility, and the sacraments. One of the joys of Augustine's later years was revising and reflecting on his earlier writings. He called this work his Retractations, a humble review of everything he had published since his conversion. He corrected errors, clarified thoughts, and expressed gratitude for the growth God had given him. This task revealed the humility that had taken root deep within him. He never saw himself as a master of truth, but as a lifelong student of God's grace. And he hoped that by correcting himself, he might help future generations avoid misunderstandings and walk more confidently toward the light. Yet even as he continued to write and serve, Augustine felt the weight of age settle gently upon him. His steps grew slower, his voice softer, his nights longer. He sensed that the Lord was preparing him for the final chapter of his earthly life. He often spoke with Alypius and his clergy about heaven, not as a distant idea, but as a home he longed for with peaceful anticipation. "When we rise there," he would say, "we shall rest and see and love and praise. This is what awaits us without end." These words, spoken with the quiet conviction of one who had tasted the nearness of God in prayer, comforted many who feared death. It was during this period of deepening stillness that the world around Augustine grew more turbulent. The Vandals, after years of conflict and movement, arrived at the gates of Hippo. The city was surrounded, the walls fortified, and a long siege began. Supplies dwindled. Fear spread. Many believed the city would soon fall. But Augustine remained at his post. The elderly bishop, frail in body but strong in spirit, refused to flee. He comforted his people, led them in prayer, distributed what little food they had, and encouraged them not to lose hope. Those who looked upon him saw not despair, but a man anchored in the certainty that God was near. During the siege, Augustine fell ill with a fever. His strength, already diminished by age, began to wane. The brothers of the monastery tended to him with love, reading scripture aloud at his request. He asked that the penitential psalms be written on large sheets and placed on the walls of his room so that he could pray them even when too weak to hold the scrolls. Day after day, he lifted his heart to God, asking forgiveness for his sins, thanking the Lord for his mercy, and praying for his people, for the church, and for the world he would soon leave behind. As the fever grew stronger, Augustine entered into a deep peace. He knew his time had come. He spent his final days not in fear, but in communion with the God who had sought him across oceans of wandering and drawn him home through the gentle whisper of grace. Those who stood at his bedside witnessed a serenity that could only be called holy. Augustine's last moments were quiet. No dramatic gestures, no final speeches, only the peaceful surrender of a soul returning to the one who created it. On a late August day in the year 430, Augustine breathed his last. The city around him was still under siege, but those who loved him felt as though a great light had risen into eternity. His life, marked by restlessness, redeemed by grace, poured out in love, had become a testament to the tender power of God's mercy. And as the brothers prayed beside him, a gentle stillness filled the room, as though heaven itself had drawn near to welcome the servant who had given everything back to the love that had first awakened his heart. Carrying the delicate hush of Augustine's passing into a wider horizon, we now enter a chapter that drifts gently beyond the limits of his earthly life. For though the bishop of Hippo closed his eyes in a world trembling from siege and uncertainty, the true measure of his life did not end with the stillness of that late August day in 430. Instead, his influence began to unfurl quietly, like dawn spreading across a sleeping landscape, touching far more lives than he ever could have imagined. A man who once wandered in confusion had become a beacon for generations of seekers. A heart once restless had become the steady pulse of Christian thought. A soul once torn by desire had become a living witness to the healing power of grace. And as time carried his memory forward, Augustine's legacy deepened, softened, widened, and took root in places he never saw and in hearts he never met. When the Vandals entered Hippo, shortly after Augustine's death, they discovered a city worn by hunger, fear, and the long ordeal of the siege. Yet even amid destruction, the monastery beside the basilica remained intact, a quiet sign, many believed, of God's protection over the place where Augustine had lived, prayed, written, and guided his flock. The brothers preserved his manuscripts, safeguarding the treasures he had labored over for decades. These writings, fragile in material but powerful in truth, would soon journey far beyond North Africa, carried across seas and deserts, protected through wars and migrations, copied by steady hands in distant monasteries, and read by souls longing to understand God more deeply. It was through these manuscripts that Augustine's voice continued to speak. His Confessions, written as a prayer rather than a biography, touched readers with its honesty. People recognized themselves in Augustine's struggles, with temptation, with pride, with confusion, with sorrow. They saw in him a companion, not a distant saint. His words helped them understand that holiness does not begin with perfection, but with recognition of one's need for God. They found comfort in his vulnerability, hope in his transformation, and inspiration in the grace that reshaped his life. Through the pages of that single book, generations discovered that God waits patiently for every wandering heart. The City of God, though written for a world shaken by Rome's fall, became a guidebook for societies across centuries. In it, Augustine offered a vision not tied to the rise and fall of empires, but to the enduring hope of heaven. His reflections on human nature, justice, community, and divine purpose echoed through medieval theology, Renaissance thought, and even modern philosophy. Kings, theologians, poets, and ordinary believers found in Augustine a mirror through which they could understand the fragile beauty of earthly life and the eternal promise that lies beyond it. His teachings on grace shaped the Church profoundly. In an age when many believed that moral striving alone could earn salvation, Augustine reminded the world that grace is not a reward for the strong, but a gift for the humble. He taught that without God, the soul flounders. With God, it finds meaning, direction, and peace. His reflections on original sin, free will, and divine mercy became touchstones for future councils and theologians. The thought of Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Anselm, and countless others blossomed from seeds planted by Augustine's writings. In monasteries across Europe, his rule, simple, pastoral, rooted in charity, formed the foundation for communities that shaped the spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. The Augustinian monks, inspired by his balance of contemplation and service, carried his spirit into education, missionary work, and prayer. Augustine's voice influenced the faith of medieval cities and the quiet devotion of rural abbeys alike, reaching both the scholarly and the simple-hearted. But his impact did not remain confined to the theological world. In the centuries after his death, artists, poets, and musicians drew inspiration from Augustine's story. Painters depicted the moment of his conversion, the tears he shed beneath the fig tree, the tenderness of Monica's embrace, the light of understanding in his study. Sculptors captured the introspective bishop with a book in one hand and a heart aflame in the other, symbols of his intellect and his love. Composers transformed his words into hymns and chants that echoed through cathedrals. The beauty of his life, distilled into art, carried his message into the senses and spirits of countless believers. Even the reformers of the 16th century, men who would challenge the Church, Augustine loved, found guidance in his writings. Luther, himself an Augustinian monk, drew strength from Augustine's teachings on grace. Calvin wrote with admiration of Augustine's clarity. This unintended influence opened new debates, new interpretations, and new paths for Christianity. And though the Church itself weathered storms of division, Augustine's voice remained a bridge, reminding all sides that the heart's deepest longing is for God. Across continents and cultures, Augustine became a companion for the wounded, the searching, the penitent, and the hopeful. People found in him a saint who understood the inner battles no one else could see, pride hidden under humility, weakness disguised as strength, wounds carried quietly for years. Augustine never pretended to be flawless, and that honesty gave courage to many. It taught them that holiness is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God within it. Yet perhaps Augustine's deepest impact emerged through a simple truth he repeated again and again. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That single line became a lantern for countless souls who felt adrift. It whispered to the wandering that their restlessness was not a flaw, but a compass pointing toward God. It reminded believers that the ache in their hearts was a holy invitation, not an emptiness to be feared, and it offered the world a gentle understanding of desire, not as something to repress, but as something to purify, guide, and ultimately fulfill in the love of God. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, boundaries shifted, but Augustine's voice endured, crossing time like a steady beacon that refuses to fade. The bishop who once wept in the garden became a doctor of the Church. The young man who once chased false philosophies became a lighthouse for truth. The seeker who once feared surrender became a guide for millions walking the same narrow, winding path toward God. In modern times, Augustine's writings continue to spark conversions, heal wounded hearts, and deepen the faith of those who encounter him. His insights into the struggles of the mind, the fragility of the will, and the mystery of the soul resonate even in a world far removed from his own. Psychologists, philosophers, theologians, and ordinary readers alike find in Augustine not only a saint, but a profoundly human companion, someone who understands the battle between desire and surrender, between doubt and faith, between wandering and home. Yet for all his influence, it is perhaps the tenderness of his story that endures most strongly. The image of Monica praying for her son with tears, the moment beneath the fig tree when grace pierced a restless heart, the quiet humility of an old bishop praying the penitential psalms as his final offering. These scenes remind believers that every soul, no matter how lost it seems, can be transformed by the gentle hand of God. And so Augustine's legacy flows onward, a river fed by the springs of his writings, his example, and his witness. It washes across centuries, soothing hearts that ache for meaning, watering seeds of faith in unexpected places, and reminding the world that grace is never far, never silent, never finished. As time carries us forward, Augustine's story continues to ask every soul the same quiet question that shaped his own life. What is the heart truly seeking, if not the one who made it? Carrying the quiet and searching question of Augustine's legacy into its final contemplative movement, we now step into the closing part of this journey, a gentle descent into stillness, where the lines between past and present soften, and where the life of a saint becomes less a distant memory and more a living presence that continues to accompany those who walk the path of faith. For though Augustine's earthly story has been told across these many parts, from his restless youth to his luminous conversion, from his pastoral labors to his peaceful death, his influence does not rest within history alone. It breathes through prayer, through scripture, through the ache and longing of every heart that seeks God with trembling hope. And as we bring this story to its close, we do so not with a sense of finality, but with the understanding that Augustine's life continues to unfold in the soul of every listener who allows his words to touch them in the quiet places where truth whispers most tenderly. Across the centuries since Augustine returned to the God he loved, countless pilgrims have walked the dusty roads of Hippo and Tagaste, standing before the ancient stones where he once preached, prayed, and wrote. They come with questions Augustine himself once carried. Why is the human heart so restless? Why does desire pull us in so many directions? Why do we long for love that no earthly affection can fully satisfy? And each pilgrim, whether learned or simple, whether burdened or seeking, finds in Augustine a companion who does not offer cold philosophy, but a living invitation to encounter God personally. His writings feel less like academic texts and more like conversations spoken across time, in which he gently guides the listener toward the one who transformed him from within. Monica, too, remains present in the hearts of believers who pray for loved ones wandering far from faith. Her quiet example teaches that patience in prayer is not wasted time, that tears offered for the sake of love are never unseen by God, and that the journey of a soul toward grace may unfold slowly, painfully, beautifully, according to a wisdom far greater than our own. Through her, many discover the courage to continue hoping when hope feels thin, trusting that God works silently in ways no one can measure. Her love is woven through Augustine's story like golden thread, an enduring reminder that no prayer spoken in sincerity is ever lost. In churches across the world, Augustine's words resound in homilies, in classrooms, in whispered confessions, in quiet spiritual direction. Priests read his sermons before preaching. Students wrestle with his reflections on grace. Parents find comfort in his acknowledgement of human frailty, and those who struggle with sins they cannot seem to overcome discover in Augustine someone who understands weakness intimately, who never denies the difficulty of conversion, and who offers reassurance that the mercy of God is wider than any failure. His voice speaks to the anxious and the sorrowful, those who ache for meaning, those who wonder whether God truly sees them, those who fear that their wandering has taken them too far from grace. To each of these souls, Augustine offers not condemnation, but consolation, reminding them that God is always nearer than they imagine. Even those who do not share Augustine's faith often find themselves drawn to the beauty of his introspection. Philosophers read him for his insights into the nature of the human will. Writers admire his honesty in confessing his struggles. Psychologists listen to his understanding of memory, desire, and the inner conflicts of the soul. Artists and musicians are inspired by the emotional landscape of his spiritual journey. In each of these fields, Augustine appears not as a distant figure from antiquity, but as a living voice, speaking plainly about the interior world that every human being carries within. He becomes, for many, a mirror, a way of seeing themselves more clearly, more compassionately, and more truthfully. And across the vast landscape of the Church, where saints, mystics, scholars, and ordinary believers have woven tapestries of holiness across the centuries, Augustine's thread remains unmistakable. His teachings influenced councils that shaped Christian doctrine. His insights nourished the spiritual lives of saints like Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Bernard of Clairvaux, Thérèse of Lisieux, and countless more. The Augustinian family, monks, friars, nuns, and lay communities, continues to carry his spirit, living out his rule with devotion to communal life, prayer, and charity. The Church names him Doctor of Grace, honoring the core truth of his story, that everything he accomplished was not his own doing, but the work of God transforming a heart that opened itself at last to love. And yet, for all the intellectual brilliance and theological influence that Augustine left behind, it is the quieter details of his story that linger most deeply in the hearts of believers. The young boy stealing pears with his friends, discovering only later that sin often springs not from desire, but from confusion. The student in Carthage searching for love in the wrong places. The young man grieving the loss of a friend, beginning to sense that every earthly love is fragile. The adult fleeing through philosophies, hoping to outrun the shadow of his own emptiness. The moment in the garden when his tears finally broke the hard knots of his heart. The waters of baptism washing away years of confusion. The son embracing his mother with gratitude after so many debates, misunderstandings, and moments of sorrow. The bishop sitting alone in the dim quiet of the basilica, praying the penitential psalms in his final days, whispering to God that every part of his life belonged entirely to him. These moments hold a tender kind of holiness, simple, unpolished, deeply human. They remind us that saints are not born radiant. They become radiant by surrendering themselves, little by little, to the God who loves them. Augustine's brilliance mattered, yes. His writings changed the world, yes. But it was his heart, unmasked, humbled, surrendered, that speaks most powerfully to those who meet him today. For every listener who carries restlessness within them, Augustine's life offers hope. His message is not that we must extinguish our desires, but that we must allow God to purify them. His story teaches that longing can become a pathway to prayer, that sorrow can lead to compassion, that weakness can become the doorway to grace. And perhaps most beautifully, Augustine reminds us that our hearts are created with infinite depth precisely because they are made to be filled by infinite love. And so, as this gentle narrative draws to a close, we stand before the question that Augustine carried through his entire life, a question whispered not with fear, but with longing, humility, and hope. If the human heart is made for God, What might it discover when it finally rests in Him? It is a question Augustine answered not only with words, but with the shape of his life. And it is a question that each of us, in our own journeys, must answer too. And so, with gratitude for the life of this remarkable saint, for his honesty, his tears, his longing, his wisdom, his prayers, we close this story softly, like a candle gently dimming at the end of evening prayer. His journey continues in every soul who seeks God with sincerity. His words remain a lantern for every traveler who feels the ache of restlessness. And his legacy whispers gently across time the invitation that shaped his story and shapes ours still, to seek, to surrender, and to rest at last in the love that made us,